What's up, guys? Welcome back to Slabbed Portfolios, the podcast where we break down the biggest comics, collectibles, and action figures so you can collect smarter and avoid costly mistakes. Please make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss any of our updates. Today, we are talking about something that most collectors don't really notice while it's happening, but it quietly drives almost every decision in the hobby. And it's the psychology of collecting, the psychology of comic collecting, and what it does to us. Because if you step back far enough, comic collecting isn't just about characters, stories, or even money. Although I know that the hobby has turned into quite a bit of the money part these last few years. It's about how people think under pressure, how they react to scarcity, how they respond to status, and how easily excitement can turn into impulse. Things can get carried away pretty quickly in this hobby. One of the biggest forces in this space is FOMO, or fear of missing out, if you will. And in comics, FOMO doesn't usually feel like fear in the moment. It feels like opportunity. It feels like being smart before everyone else catches on. You see a book start to move, maybe it's getting a little more attention online, maybe auction prices tick up, right? We've all seen this. Maybe a character gets rumored for a show or a movie or a second season or whatever. And suddenly the comic doesn't feel like it did a week ago. It feels like it has momentum. That's where the psychology kicks in. Because the truth is, the comic itself didn't change. It's the same comic it was before the hype train came along. The paper didn't improve. As a matter of fact, it probably got worse, probably deteriorated even a little bit more. The story didn't change. It didn't suddenly become better than it was before. What changed is perception. And perception is incredibly sensitive in collecting markets. Once enough people start believing that something is heating up, that belief alone can create real movement. And once that movement starts, it becomes self-reinforcing. People buy because it's going up. It goes up then because people are buying. And the worst part is that it feels rational while it's happening. Nobody, and I mean nobody, thinks they're chasing anything. Everyone thinks they're getting in early, even when the wave has already started forming. That's why so many collectors end up with similar stories. Oh, I should have bought it when it was cheaper. Or on the other side, I bought it right before it cooled off. I mean, you hear these two vantage points all the time. Pick a comic show. How many times have you, or just people that you know in the hobby, say these things. The emotional experience is always tied to timing, not just the comic itself. Then there's the grading, which introduces a completely different layer of psychology for us. Once a comic is slabbed, the conversation often shifts away from the actual book and into the numbers, right? A 9.8, a 9.6, a 9.4, yada, yada, yada. And while those differences can matter in strict market terms, the psychological effect is much bigger than the physical difference in the comic itself. Collectors start chasing perfection. They want a higher grade. They don't want to just own the comic, but owning the best version of it. They want the version of it that's better than all their buddies. And that pursuit can become its own loop. You buy a 9.6, then you wonder if you should have waited for a 9.8. Then you get the 9.8. Then you start thinking about white pages versus off-white pages. It becomes a ladder that never really ends because there's always a slightly better copy somewhere out there. And what's interesting is that this chase isn't purely financial. A lot of it is emotional validation. A high grade feels like confirmation that you made the right decision, that you picked the right copy, and that you didn't settle. It becomes less about the comic and more about what owning that grade says about your judgment. That ties directly into something else that doesn't get talked about enough, which is the ego side of collecting, and I touched on that a little bit. Comics are one of those hobbies where knowledge becomes status. Knowing first appearances, knowing print runs, knowing which books are sleepers, all of that becomes kind of a currency, if you will. And in any environment where knowledge equals status, there's always pressure to be right. Not just to enjoy the hobby, but to be early, to be informed, to be ahead of the curve. That's why debates about undervalued books or next big keys get so intense. It's not just disagreement about comics, it's disagreement about who sees the future more clearly. Even collecting decisions can start to reflect identity. The books you own can feel like a statement. Not just about what you like, but about what you believe will matter later on, later down the road. And once that happens, selling a comic can feel less like a transaction and more like admitting you were wrong. On the emotional side, comics are also deeply tied to nostalgia, and that creates another powerful layer of decision making. A lot of collectors aren't just buying a character, they're buying a version of themselves from a different time. That's why certain characters or eras always seem to hold value differently. They're attached to memory, not just demand. And memory is not rational. It doesn't care about print runs or market saturation. It cares about how something felt. So when someone sees a comic they loved as a kid, or a character they grew up with, it's very easy for logic to step aside. That emotional pull is strong enough to override hesitation, even when the price doesn't really make sense on paper. This is also where regret comes in, because the same emotional wiring that drives buying decisions also shapes how people remember past ones. If a comic goes up after you sold it, it doesn't just become a missed opportunity, it becomes a story you replay. And if you buy something that drops in value, that stays with you too, even if the rest of your collection is doing just fine. The mind tends to weight those moments more heavily than the wins. A good buy feels normal after a while, but a bad buy sticks. We remember those sting. And then there's something even a little more subtle, which is social comparison. Even if collectors don't openly admit it, there's always awareness of what others have, what somebody else picked up, what somebody else graded, what somebody else sold it for. It creates a quiet reference point in the background of almost every decision. That doesn't mean that collecting is unhealthy, it just means it's human. People naturally measure themselves against context, especially in hobbies where value is visible and public. The interesting thing is that all these forces, FOMO, grading obsession, ego, nostalgia, social comparison, whatever you want to call it, they don't operate separately. They stack on top of each other. A nostalgic book gets hyped, FOMO kicks in, grading difference adds urgency. Ego reinforces the decision buy because nobody wants to miss what everybody else sees. And suddenly, a purchase feels inevitable rather than chosen. That's the part worth paying attention to as a collector. Not because any of it is inherently bad, but because awareness changes how you move. Now, when you can recognize when you're reacting versus deciding, you gain a little bit more control over what you actually want your collection to look like. That's where you want to be. You want to be making better decisions based on what you want to do, not what everybody tells you to do. But above all else, at the end of the day, and what's most important, is that comics and comic collecting is supposed to be fun. They're supposed to connect you to stories, characters, moments that matter to you personally. The psychology just sits underneath everything, whether you notice it or not. And the goal isn't to eliminate it, it's to understand it well enough so that it doesn't make decisions for you, so that it doesn't make you make decisions and purchases that are not good for you, that are going to hurt you in the long run. And that's what makes a collector smarter over time. Not just knowing what to buy, but knowing why you're buying it to begin with. And if you can get that part right, if you can sort those reasons out, then the rest of it tends to follow. I hope the information in today's episode has helped you guys out a little bit. And thanks for listening to the Slabbed Portfolios podcast. And I'll see you guys on the next one.